Dia 17, dia de perna. Agora é 2h22 da manhã. E eu tô aqui editando porra de vídeo. Falta ainda um bocado. Em vez de fazer o negócio, eu fazer logo. Tô com fome. Acabou a comida que eu comi ali umas 3 horas atrás. Então, bora fazer. Hoje é dia de perna e abdominal. Perna e abdominal é a mesma coisa. O core junto. Só que aí o core, em vez de fazer aquelas coisas assim na parede, você já tá fazendo efeito. Eu vou tentar fazer aqui. Vou ver o que vai dar. Mas o perna eu vou fazer. Faço 15 ou faço 12? Só que eu vou fazer 15. Lento. Squat lento. E aí eu vou ver como eu vou fazer o do abdômen.
I wanted to simply know the whys and wherefores. So he's very clear about his intention of this letter. He wanted to know about testosterone and what it does, right? And the guy that wrote him back, which seemed to have some kind of knowledge about it, he's being misquoted as being a doctor, which I highly doubt. And he basically screws up the history of testosterone. But as you mentioned, this is not evidence of use. It's not even a prescription. It's just a query. Of course, it is well known that John Grimmick would meet Dr. Ziegler later on, 10 years later actually, and start using it. But there's that grey area again of 10 years.
Okay, so how likely do you think it is that these drugs would be responsible for the physiques that we see in the silver era? So, like, are these physiques built off of this early testosterone use, or how much of an impact, in your opinion, did these drugs have on the physiques we see from the 1940s?
Okay, so again, this is assuming that they took testosterone, to correct you. So I think I want to reference both videos this time, and that's the recent video or actually talk about that specifically. But within that video, I reference a video that's doing quite well now on YouTube that I put out, and that's called The Natural Limits of Hypertrophy, and it's important because it leads to the answer you're looking for. So within this video, I assess the Bronze Era athletes based on their fat-free mass index. And this is from a paper where I reference a paper from Professor Jan Todd from the Stark Center of Physical Culture. And although the fat-free mass index is not reliable as we would like
12 em extremo slow motion tá bom, né?
it's one of the best examples
Vai de 12 não é crescimento não.
to determine if an athlete is on steroids or not. And when you look at some of the
Agora esse aqui eu não sei como é que faz essa desgraça não. Nunca fiz esse tipo de exercício não, essa bosta. Vou tentar levantar minha perna. Então que a pessoa levanta a perna assim, ó. Eu vou tentar só levantar meu joelho, que acho que vai ser o que vai dar.
Now, assuming that Bronze Era athletes are natural, and I'm pretty sure they are, because testosterone wasn't even synthesized at the time, and the oral testosterone that was available in the Silver Era, and even the injectable, which both had very short half-lives, wouldn't have made so much of a difference, because and there's several reasons. It's not just the fat mass index in comparison to basically say that Silver Era Silver Era bodybuilders were natural. That's again, we're still assuming that, but if we look at the photographs of certain bodybuilders before testosterone was even created, it kind of confirms this. And a great example is, again, the man of the hour right now, which is John Grimmick, right? If we look at his physique in the mid-1930s and prior, I'm talking 1933, 34, and 35, he had already developed quite a heavy muscular physique, obviously well before testosterone was even synthesized. And although this letter came out in 1943, where he first asks about that, we can then assume that even if he started using oral testosterone from 1943 onwards, that would mean that he still had 8 years as a natural after testosterone was created. And so we're talking
Fiz 6 e
progressive
ficou uma bosta.
increase in muscle mass, right? It is well reported even so that let's say he never
Vou misturar com um Zabi também. Fiz 6 ali.
it is definite that
Não cansou nada, velho. Cansou meu braço.
that he's getting absolutely nothing from it. That instead he complained about
Vou fazer o Zabi normal ali também, fazer 12.
negative side effects to the testosterone that he was administered. And so I highly doubt that even if the silver era bodybuilders were using testosterone in the mid to late 1940s, that it would have an impact on their physique, because again, the fat-free mass index didn't change after the synthesis of testosterone in the 30s and 40s, and you only really see a change, a real change, in the mid to late 1950s and beyond that, when it is known that there was a sudden explosion in the new synthetic hormones that appeared on the market.
Right. So this might take us down a little bit of a tangent. I hope you don't mind. But assuming that there was some experimentation, but that it didn't have any real major impact on the physiques at the time, you have a lot of people, I think, rightly pointing out that something happened in the silver era, right? Because these guys, they didn't look like the bronze era bodybuilders, even though their FFMIs might be similar, right? They look different, like the shape, the aesthetics, it's not what we saw in the bronze era. So, I'm happy to give my thoughts on this as well, but what do you think, is it, a lot of people will say, oh, testosterone was synthesized, so they just started using steroids, and that's why they look different. What would be your explanation as to why silver era bodybuilders suddenly look so different and perhaps so much more aesthetic than the bronze era bodybuilders?
So it's a good question again, and I can understand why people would go, look at these silver era bodybuilders, they're just gargantuan in comparison to the bronze era lifters. And yeah, I mean, there's a point there, but people forget that not only was the hormone, I guess, science changing over the decades, but also bodybuilding principles in itself. You had the development of the breathing squat, as well as the application of, I guess, the bench press in the silver era, which really changed the physique. You had the rib cage expansion creating these barrel-like chests, and on top of that, they would emphasize on the bench press, and that's when you really started seeing bench press records skyrocket. And again, I talk about this in a recent video that I created. And therefore, the biggest changes that you really see between the bronze and silver era is the chest muscles. And I mean, you clearly highlighted that in your viral video, why bronze era athletes have flat chests. And I mean, I tried to follow that up by highlighting the importance of the breathing squat and the focus on the bench press, which created that silver era look that was so different to the bronze era lifters. I mean, I'll also state here that it's very difficult to say whether it was purely that or not, because as the silver era progressed and the testosterone experiments started in the early to mid 50s, the physiques also get more and more massive, and that's really where you can start asking and really start being suspicious as to whether it was only that. But I mean, again, mid to late 40s, it's still very much in the air whether they were experimenting at all. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. But in my own opinion, it was the change in principles initially that caused this change. And sure, as experimentation started to ramp up, I'm pretty sure that not just experimentation started to ramp up, but the hormones began to become way more effective 50s, as I mentioned in my.
Yeah, so just to continue on with what you're saying, I mean, you know, in the Bronze Era, I mean.
Não, o Sulenta é fodido demais, que é bagulho explosivo. O Sulenta mantém a atenção o tempo todo, né? Mas o explosivo desce lento e sobe rápido. Pula. Posso fazer de uma perna só, né? Uma curva, uma variação. Tem que ver. Vida é foda. Dos braços já tá mais certo, agora tem que ver do lábio direito.
Right? It's not really bodybuilding as we know it today that was happening in the Bronze Era, and mainly their physiques were just built as a consequence of whatever other endeavor they were doing. It wasn't really purely bodybuilding, and it's really in the Silver Era that bodybuilding as its like standalone thing really started to flourish, and you started getting the Mr. America and all of these like really really popular bodybuilding shows. And you started getting like career bodybuilders, right? People who just made it their pure focus to build their bodies into a certain shape and to chase a certain aesthetic, right? And so obviously that brought in certain judging standards for the bodybuilding shows and also training principles, as you mentioned. So I think a lot of that can really explain the change in shape from the Bronze Era to the Silver Era, right? Even if the Bronze Era guys managed to build a
Meu braço cansa, é uma posição horrível. E eu tô ficando assim, tem que ficar um rolo nesse aqui, né? Eu não tenho uma facilidade para fazer com a perna estendida. E essa leve aqui assim, só subir aqui eu nem sinto. Meu braço cansa de ficar estendido assim, numa posição fodida. Meu dedo dói também. Eu sou muito confortável nessa porra. E eu nem sinto nos hábitos bagunçando isso aqui assim. Sinto peso no braço quando eu vou levantar as pernas.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the difference. I mean, you've got changing principles in parallel with improved hormone synthesis, and they both just kind of marry eventually. And it's you initially, see the Bronze Era, as you mentioned, that these guys are shaped by function, by what they're doing, which in their case is strongmanism. They're doing odd lifts, they're doing hand balancing, they're doing muscle control, and really with muscle control, you start seeing things go off on a little tangent of bodybuilding right there, because the mind-muscle connection is established. This is now taken by Silver Era bodybuilders. A lot of people, believe that Silver Era bodybuilding was vastly different from the Bronze Era. I'd have to argue against that. Just like we look at the Golden Era as our heroes, the Golden Era athletes like Arnold, etc., would look at Jack Dellinger, Steve Reeves, and John Grimmick, Rich Park as their idols. Whereas Rich Park and Reeves and Grimmick would look at Sandow and Pandur and Sig Klein and George Hackenschmidt as their idols. And so they would obviously not try and reinvent the wheel too much and copy their idols. The Silver Era bodybuilders still performed odd lifts, and eventually weightlifting was organized into a sport. Again, this happened during the Silver Era. Sure, they started to develop their own principles and started to combine now the Bronze Era methods, but with new bodybuilding principles with a focus on bodybuilding, which is why you had the split between weightlifters, who were the Hoffman boys, the York gang, and you had the... Sorry?
Muito próximo.
Yeah, the weeders. So you had the weeders following bodybuilding, and you had this branching effect and this forking effect in the Iron Gang. Weightlifters and bodybuilders. And of course, bodybuilders...
Eu fiz esse daqui e esqueci o outro, né? Puta merda. Vou fazer o outro, vou vir pra cá e depois vou fazer outro novo. Bem que a perna tava cansada mais.
The synthesis of better hormones, and even just greater focus on pure bodybuilding and throwing basically weightlifting out the window, these guys just focus on building muscle mass. And you know, combining, of course, heavy compound lifting with isolation methods, and started to not just experiment, but with hormones, but really started to understand how to use them better. And in that regard, I would say that there would have been, in my opinion, some influence from experimentation at the very latest in the mid 50s to the early 60s, because you really see the physiques suddenly change from the 60s, and you know, in the 60s they start becoming really big, but in the 70s you start getting big bodies that are shredded, and you really see this evolution of physique enhancement, along with the changing and better creation of synthetic hormones.
Right. Yeah, because the silver era guys, they were never particularly lean, and that's another big difference between the bronze and the silver era guys, right? You have a lot of like really shredded guys from the bronze era who weren't that big. You know, you got these 160-pound guys, right, who looked crazy, right, but they were rather small and very shredded. Whereas in the silver era, you had these much bigger looking guys who, you know, over 200 pounds. But they're not shredded by any means. I mean, you know, we're talking over 15% body fat in many cases, and often you can barely see their abs, right? And then later is when you get this combination of this, you know, huge size, 240 pounds, and also like single-digit body fat, which is just, you know, unobtainable for a natural body. All right. So another thing I wanted to touch on. Which you discussed in your video a bit, right? So in the late 50s, well, starting in the mid 50s with Ziegler, they start experimenting with testosterone, right?
É muito lento, pega a porra da
According
contagem.
to Ziegler's experiments, you know, after seeing the Russians, he comes back home, he tests out the testosterone, and it doesn't really do what he wanted it to do, right? And then he starts, developing Dianabol with Ciba Pharmaceutical and all that. So I thought it was interesting, and you mentioned this, how why was there this quest for better hormones, for ones that would work better, be more anabolic, be less androgenic? If testosterone was already working so well for bodybuilders, if testosterone was already building these amazing physiques, then why was there this need to go out and find something better? And why was there even this need to experiment with testosterone in the first place if it would have already been like this well-established thing?
Essa bosta puxa mais nas pernas que no abdômen.
Pokes a little hole in this idea of testosterone already being like well-established among bodybuilders, because then why does Ziegler come and experiment with it, and then why does he conclude that it's not that useful and then try and search for something better, right?
Well, you just basically said it. It sounds like they're just trying. I mean, the issue is that a lot of people associate the synthesis of testosterone with a sudden impact on physiques, which in my opinion, as already stated, is not the case. And I actually have addressed this not just in my recent video, but I revised a very important booklet
E eu fiz errado, porque eu já tinha feito
in
no outro.
1971 by Wayne Glash, who of course lived through this time. And the video where I actually showcased this book, which I also uploaded recently, was the title you just mentioned, The Quest for Better Steroids, right?
Foi o terceiro?
And I really asked the audience
Foi. Vou ter perdido
in these two videos, for those that are really adamant that testosterone was working from day one,
Eu não fiz esse
obviously
aqui.
it was not.
Buguei minha
Why
mente.
would scientists
Fiz um,
during
fiz um e fiz um.
This is actually
Bom,
biochemistry. It's
aí eu
called
fiz
the golden era
fiz
of
um
hormones,
e errei esse
right?
aqui.
Or the
E
golden
não
era
puta
of
perna. Eu fiz
endocrinology.
3 pernas
Because after the synthesis of
e aí agora
testosterone,
eu fiz o terceiro desse aqui.
you had a
Agora.
sudden race from scientists to try and make effective
Qual foi o
hormones.
segundo desse aqui?
They realized
Eu pulei o
the
segundo.
anabolic properties
Puta merda, eu fiz o terceiro daquele ali.
when these were tested on athletes in the
Fiz
mid
três?
50s.
Eu fiz
They
só dois.
found
Minha mãe tá confusa demais.
the
Caralho,
reason
what the
totally
fuck?
what they thought it would be. They
Mas esse aqui
understood that
é
testosterone
só
had this
fica.
anabolic
Tem esse aqui, não tem?
quality because I mean
Esse aqui é
we
o
men
quarto.
have more muscle
Já acabou já?
than women. But
Contagem.
the quest there was how can we
Esse aqui é.
enhance the anabolic properties further
Não é não.
and
Ah,
reduce the
caralho.
androgenic effect, because the issue with testosterone, especially with the earlier formulations and compounds, was that the androgenic effect was from the 17A residue in testosterone. That's what they found out. In the 40s and 50s, they eventually found that this residue was, for some reason, what gave the androgenic effect. And when taking in higher amounts or in a long-term course, would cause all these side effects. This is why when Ziegler found out about the Russians using the testosterone on their athletes, when they tried it with the Americans, it was unsuccessful. He reported back to Ziegler and told them, it's not working. Ziegler started scratching their heads and going, why isn't it working? We need to focus on the androgenic effects. And as Wayne Galash describes in his booklet, which I again reviewed in my recent video, you see two different strategies come up, and you can really see how the scientists are thinking. They go, okay, what makes, how can we actually reduce the androgenic quality in testosterone? And they have two solutions for that, or at least two thought processes. One is to actually mix estrogen with testosterone, which they found was growing boobies on these athletes. And they basically said, oh, this is not a good idea because now we're getting big guys with boobs, right? So they threw that and all the formulations that they created, this estrogen testosterone mix, out the window.
Nossa,
And
pronto.
then the other one was to actually
Tô
change the
com quanta
structure
altura
of
de novo, velho.
testosterone, which of course
Tem que pesquisar essa porra, né?
was the successful
Será que é intensidade? Não tô descansando direito?
explosion of
Tem que comer alguma coisa antes? Tô com fome essa porra. Você não faz que eu tô com fome porque já é tarde e tô querendo ir dormir. Não tem comida pra comer não, ele tá foda.
And this is a really important point for people to try and understand. And I say it again, I'll say it again. Why reinvent the wheel? You had 20 years where you could have made millions of dollars on testosterone. But guess what? It didn't work. Why would you continue to invest more money in something that's already working? It doesn't make any sense, as I stated in my videos. That's why scientists kept going back onto the lab and trying to figure out how to make, a testosterone derivative more anabolic. And it finally happened 20 years later. And it's reflected by the physiques. It's reflected by the reports of athletes suddenly starting to use steroids. And really, one of the best things that actually
Eu cansei a perna, ó.
is the reaction to the
Muito não é foda.
Here is where you really see the effect of new drugs. And I'll give you an example. After I think around the 1920s and 1930s, athletes began to use, it is well known, endurance athletes at least, started to use things like amphetamines in the Olympic Games. And the question of ethics started to come in. And suddenly the Olympic Committee made a regulation for doping. And you can actually read all about this in the history of doping. There wasn't any talk about steroids back then by the Olympic Committee. That came later on, after the 60s. And I think it was during the late 70s or in the early 80s when the Olympic Committee finally banned steroids. If they had such an impact in the 40s and 50s, wouldn't you think that the Olympic Committee would have, nipped
Eu tenho que...
the bud, as they say,
Eu acho que só fiz 2 do abdominal ali na cama, não foi?
necessarily
Acho que tá faltando um então, foda-se.
all being used so proliferatively by athletes. This occurred in the 60s and 70s. That's why you see the ban occurring thereafter. Right?
And interestingly, we could also comment on sort of the perception of like being natural and not natural and enhanced and steroids, right? We have all these terms that we use now, and all of this, stigma and baggage that goes along with steroid use. Now we have natural bodybuilding, we have enhanced bodybuilding, but this sort of separation didn't exist in the 40s and in the 50s, right? They saw these things. Maybe the way they saw vitamins or the way we see creatine today or protein powder or something, right? They saw it as they didn't see it as like, oh, I'm gonna take this drug and it's gonna make me a not natty bodybuilder, right? And it's gonna ruin my legacy or something, right? That's not the, we look back now and we're applying our current mentality onto these people, but really this was just like a new thing that was coming out, just like vitamins were coming out, and maybe they were trying it out, but it wasn't in the context of steroids or natural or not natural bodybuilding, right?
Absolutely. I mean, now you're touching on the history of supplementation and nutrition. I mean, if we look back in the Bronze Era, there basically weren't any supplements except for a couple of extracts that were rich in proteins, which I've talked about in other videos. You suddenly see nutrition come into the conversation in the 50s with, bodybuilders starting to talk about protein and milk and eggs, and suddenly by the early 50s, all the muscle mags are advertising proteins and liver tablets and wheat germ, etc. Supplementation now comes in soon after, after these testosterone derivatives synthesized and Vanabol comes out. And I've spoken to a lot of these golden era bodybuilders. They considered it simply like a vitamin, like a supplement. And I can tell you that, for example, Don Howarth has told me in our interviews that to him, it was handed around in the gym whenever it was available, and it came sporadically. There'd be a guy with a bottle.
Por hoje foi isso aí.
From the doctor, somehow, and give a couple of
Hoje tá ficando mais intenso, ó, tô começando a suar. Tá indo, tô me acostumando com o exercício que eu fiz no começo. É extremamente leve, sem efeito. E agora tá no progressivo overload assim, tá pesando mais, tá começando a treinar mesmo.